In the face of women's increased activity, their movement into men's jobs, and their honorable service in the military, men reevaluated their experiences of masculinity. They turned briefly from valuing themselves as providers to valuing themselves as protectors of home and country. Men had their own ways of preserving self-esteem. Here's one of them. Those who served in the Air Force decorated their planes with what we call nose cone art or pin-ups. They drew on the planes figures of scantily dressed women in sexualized poses. They named their planes after their favorite female movie stars, sexualizing military activity and turning bombing raids into demonstrations of masculine prowess. Then there was the question of how men would function in the home. After all, men who'd been in the Army for 2, 3, sometimes 4 years returned home to women who'd been taking care of elderly parents and families and earning a living while their men were gone. Shortly before the war ended, the question of whether women would willingly return home emerged. As the war drew to an end, most menfolk simply assumed that women would give up their jobs without resistance. Rising birth rates, a baby boom that followed in 47, 48, 49, and 50, demonstrated the power of male thinking. Briefly at least, women succumbed to male desire to return women to women's proper place. There was yet another way in which women were encouraged to return home. Their children needed them. 1948 and 1949 witnessed an enormous fear of juvenile delinquency. Children left unsupervised during the war now required parental attention. Left neglected, they would turn into a lost generation of children, a criminal generation. Returning women to the home, then, meant keeping the home safe for children and keeping the community safe as well. Less apparently, women became convinced that returning to their proper roles demanded certain kinds of behavior. Women's destiny, their roles as feminine icons, were vested in their personas and their personalities, or so they were taught. Among the architects of this belief system were Marinia Farnham and Ferdinand Lundberg, who wrote what became a best-selling volume called Modern Women, the Lost Sex. Farnham and Lundberg insisted that dressing seductively and remaining sexually enticing were part of retaining happy marriages and self-esteem. A woman, they argued, needed to invest herself in her family and her home in all the ways that Victorian women had been encouraged to do. To redeem womanhood, she would think of herself as primarily a supportive helpmeet. Modern women were supported by psychologists like Helene Deutsch, who argued that the psychology of women was such that unless they operated in subordinate, dependent, and supportive roles, they were courting psychological disaster in the form of neurosis or even psychosis. These attacks on women became part of the arsenal of masculine restoration, undermining at least some of what women had been able to accomplish during the war years. Then the government stepped in to provide benefits to men who had served in the military. Generous veterans' benefits, routinely refused even to women who had served, subsidized home mortgages with low interest rates and federally guaranteed payments. Even relatively poor and working-class men could now afford to house their families in ways they could never have imagined during the Great Depression. The GI Bill provided veterans' benefits for education as well, and many men who had served in the armed services managed to acquire college education and vocational training free from tuition and sometimes with living benefits attached. Veterans' benefits also included health care, not only for wounds and damages that had occurred during the war, but for damage that occurred after it. Veterans' benefits offered an American standard of living to men who had served in the military. They underwrote home ownership and sufficient education to garner a job of one's choice. Because these benefits went to men and not to women, they enhanced the value of masculinity. To women, they provided a clear message. Their wartime service might have been good, but it was not as valuable as the men had offered to the country.